The following message was given at Calvary Christian Fellowship in Colton, California. Calvary Christian Fellowship is a Calvary Chapel affiliated church meeting at the Lawrence Hutton Center, 660 Colton Avenue. If you live in the area and do not have a church home, we'd welcome you to ours. For more information about and Bible study resources from CCF, please visit us on Facebook or at our website, ccfcolton.com. We pray that you will grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, and that you will be blessed as you study God's Word with us.
1 Samuel 18, verse 22, And Saul commanded his servants, communicate with David secretly and say, Look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke those words in the hearing of David, and David said, Does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am poor and lightly esteemed man? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, In this manner David spoke. Then Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, The king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. In David's mind, slaying Goliath was just another routine victory that anybody could have achieved because God's reputation had been insulted. He might have even wondered about how long it was going to be until he got back to his sheep. I almost see David asking, when's lunch? This one battle, though, changes everything for David. He goes from being a shepherd in the North 40 of his father's field to becoming a national hero overnight. God has given David a platform upon which promotion would naturally occur beyond the shadow of anyone's doubt. What would be required of him now? How would he maintain his walk? Because believe it or not, friends, what's more dangerous than poverty is success. Success in the Christian life. That's a more dangerous thing. Some of us would like, instead of poverty, to have success, just to see. I'll prove you wrong. But believe me, it is more difficult. And this chapter gives us 3 sections to examine in this regard. First of all, we'll see in verse 1 through 5, David's success. Second, verse 6 through 9, we'll see Saul's seething. And then verse 10 through 30, third section, Saul's subversion. David's success, Saul's seething, and Saul's subversion. Let's take a look here at verse 1. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. At the end of chapter 17, King Saul had Abner bring David to him for a personal interview. As David is leaving the king's presence, Jonathan, the king's oldest son, the prince of Israel, rushes out to meet him. I don't think I'm reading too much into the passage when I say that I believe hearing David speak to Saul finalized the great impression that David had made upon Jonathan. Here was a man who was the bona fide hero of the nation of Israel. When he stood before King Saul and he spoke, he likely spoke of the Lord's glory and might. He doesn't boast or point out his exploits in battle. He doesn't prattle on about his strategy or speak of what plans he has next for the next giant that comes up against Israel. He just honors the Lord. When Jonathan saw his pure heart for the Lord and his confident trust in the Lord, he must have soared internally, especially considering what he saw every other day in the king's presence. Jonathan was not a man like his father. Jonathan was like David. He had had the same experience the last time the Philistines came into town. He knew firsthand what David was experiencing in this moment. Incidentally, I'm convinced that Jonathan hadn't even been allowed to go to this current battle lest he outshine his father. I really believe that Saul gave him some other kind of duty so that he wouldn't come with that same line of, hey, God can deliver with a few or with many. Do you think Jonathan was resentful? Do you think that he believed that this glory should have been his? I love what Jonathan reveals here. A man after God's heart isn't concerned with who God uses to provide victory. He is simply thrilled that God is moved and victory has been gained. Now, there's no room in the kingdom for men who are zealous to be the only ones that God uses. You know, if it won't be me, I really hope it's you. And if it's not our church, I hope it's a church in our area that God uses to touch and bring victory to this valley, to bring a culture to this city. This city needs it. And if it's not us, I pray it's somebody. But Jonathan's heart was not jealous of David, but zealous for the Lord. That's where our hearts should be. And it's no wonder that they formed this instant, lasting bond. When two work together for the same goal, for the Lord's glory, well, that'll be the same result. You'll find yourself bonded to people that maybe you would not have been otherwise. You'll find bonds forming with people who love the Lord because that's eternal. I mean, we can form bonds on a seasonal basis. If you're a Laker fan, we can be friends, really deep, good, personal friends for a long time, at least during the season. If you play music, we can have a long friendship. But if you're talking, you and I are bonded in the things of Jesus Christ, we're talking eternity. And these guys were bound in their hearts together. Verse 2, Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Saul brought David into his company of fighting men. That's been his policy from the beginning. When he found a mighty man, he brought him into his entourage. David's days of shepherding are officially over. The king has this new man, this new celebrated hero in his entourage. How does Jonathan respond to that? Note this next verse carefully. Jonathan the prince and David made a covenant. Jonathan was the rightful heir to the throne, and here is a man popular enough to catapult beyond him. Well, how would you feel about that? How would you have treated that moment? You're going to be the king. Once Saul dies, you are rightfully in the place of being the sovereign ruler over the nation. How would you have fared in this moment? How would you have treated that man? Instead of looking at David with suspicion or making him, quote unquote, earn his place, Jonathan and David made a covenant of friendship together, initiated by Jonathan, who loved David as himself. There's an ancient saying that I read this week that captures this thought well. Friendship is an entire sameness and one soul. A friend is another self. Jonathan saw himself in David. These two were the same guy, separated by two bodies. Jonathan sealed this covenant with a gift that only a prince could give, consisting of royal clothes and armor. Remember, before this, David had not been a warrior. Jonathan looks at him, he goes, listen, you can't run around like a shepherd anymore. Jonathan made sure he had the tools to fit his new occupation as Israel's champion. But don't miss the subtlety here. Jonathan is admitting that God has chosen another man where he would have been. God has said, this is the man who's going to replace Saul. Jonathan accepted. This was God's choice. And so he took off his robe, all of his royal ornamentation, and he placed it upon David. What a man! Jonathan's friendship, but more so, Jonathan's love for the Lord demanded that he invest in David personally, blessing him out of what he had, with an eye to his success. It's great to love a person because they love the Lord. That's great. We should love people who love Jesus. It's great to welcome them into fellowship. But it's godly to actually bless them out of our own resource so that they succeed in the things of God. Let me ask you, are you willing to practically meet that need when it's you who's being replaced? When it's you who's being asked to step aside? What a heart that he shows here. Jonathan gave him his robe, his armor, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Everything that David had at this moment to serve had been Jonathan's. It even had Jonathan's little nameplate on it. And to scratch it out and put David. Here's a man motivated by his love and zeal for David? No, for God. Willing to personally give of himself to another that God is using. He's certainly going to need everything Jonathan could give him. Because look at what happens. Saul, he begins to lean upon David immediately. He sends him out on these varying duties. And wherever he went, the result was the same. The Bible says he behaved wisely. The phrase speaks of a man who was careful to seek out the best way to perform a duty properly. Do you remember what Saul's servant said about David? In chapter 16, verse 18, remember? He was a man who was prudent in speech. His life, the way he conducted his life, the mannerisms that he brought to his shepherding was wise. When he was just a tiny little shepherd boy, the way he conducted his life was careful, discerning, expedient. Now, while this is not the same word that was used in chapter 16, the thoughts are certainly related. The same behavior pattern is seen here, but in a higher place of authority. Do you understand that? Let me put it to you this way. What you practice in private will be what you do in public. What you are before God privately, in small, quote-unquote, insignificant things, will be what you become publicly for the Lord. A lot of Christians believe, when I get to this place of service, then I will be this way. As if we could just turn it on. As if somehow we're going to become these super spiritual people when we get the super spiritual thing that we're aiming at. Folks, it doesn't happen that way. If you're not already a giant killer when you're facing the ants, you'll never kill a giant in your life when he actually shows himself. Our walk requires discipline. It requires us to be on top of our game every day in front of the most insignificant people that we think somehow don't matter. And we would never say that. I would never say that person doesn't matter, but I would live it by not praying before I go to work, by not reading my Bible and thinking that what I've read is going to be significant for what I'm about to see. If I don't practice in private, I wouldn't expect, if I were you, to be used in public. Understand that principle. For David, shepherding was the same as being the king because he worked like a king when he was a shepherd. Good things to think about. And for a man like this, God promotes a guy like this, and Saul sees it. He promptly promoted David over all the men and all the people and all the servants. All these guys, the people of God and Saul's servants, they all approved. Think of this. Many of you have been around men. Some of you in here are men. Not all, but some of you in here are men. You've been around other guys. You know what it's like to come into a job, and you know about rank and file. You know about seniority. David has killed one giant, and now he's everyone's boss. Think about that, guys. What would you feel? The rookie has come in. He barely knows how to hold a sword. He only knows how to use a slingshot. And everyone thinks that was a pretty lucky shot. And Goliath's head was pretty big. But now he's my boss? Think of the awkwardness of that. Saul propelled David up the ladder with little thought to that reality. Far from falling under the weight of the action, David thrived. These men watched how he did things, how conscientious he was, and how he loved them because he was one of them. Saul was a servant right alongside of him. He never lorded it over them. He just came alongside of and did the same thing they were doing. David has favor with the king. He has favor with his best friend, the prince. He has favor with God's people and Saul's servants. Everything is looking up. I mean, if we stopped here, it'd be a great end of the story. We could all go home and enjoy our afternoon lattes. But that's not how this ends. Everything's going good until verse 6. I want you to understand something before we move there. One battle changed it all for him, right? One battle, one Goliath changed everything for David. One song is about to change it in the other direction. Take a look here. Saul's seething, verse 6. Now it happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands. Now stop there. The slaying of Goliath and Elah had been the beginning of their conflict. Israel had pushed the Philistines back into their cities as far as Ekron. The women have a great reason to lead the celebration, as most of all their men are returning home. So no wonder they're singing and dancing, and there's tambourines. And folks, believe me, just because tambourines in the Bible doesn't mean we'll ever use them. Please, don't think, oh look, it's biblical. Okay, it's not. It's not biblical. And a lot of people ask me all the time, can Christians dance? And I always answer, some can, some can't. And some shouldn't. Please. You don't want to see those things, especially before lunch. Come on. So there's a big celebratory thing in the main thoroughfare. Back into Gibeah of Saul provided the parade route, and as usual, Saul was the big highlight. Here comes the king. And the song starts to emerge out of this crowd of people. Saul has slain his thousands. I could see Saul just chest up, bumped up in pride. Now, he hadn't done so well in the last couple of weeks, but he had been a military hero in the past. He liked that part. He thought, that's catchy. I think that's a good tune. Let's write this one down. Let's make sure it gets into the books. It was the next part that really turned his stomach. Look at this, verse 7b. And David, his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. David has 10,000s. Now, okay, they're in the same thing, right? Saul's up in front on his Tournament of Roses float. David's just behind. When David heard the lyric, he undoubtedly smiled at the turn. Like he never would have thought, like, oh, that's cool. That's really nice of them. You know, real sheepish. Oh, shucks. I wouldn't say 10,000s. I mean, like 9,999, but not 10,000. Boy, let's not over-exaggerate. It was pleasant at first. And I think the second chorus was, okay, guys, let's calm this thing down. Third chorus is like, he's now beat red. Just embarrassed. He's getting all this attention. Remember, he's a guy that's used to being out with a bunch of sheep. He's not a public figure. So this is not an exciting thing for him. But on the front float, up in front, as the song caught on, and people started to sing that second line with vigor, Saul became more and more agitated. Imagine seeing this on TV. You're watching it at home, drinking your hot cocoa. Far from letting it roll off his back and seeing it in the light of the excitement stirred up from David's recent victory, the king was incensed. Literally, he was quaking with anger. So here's all this celebration, and you start to see on Saul's face, he's not happy about something. The camera pans over to him, gets that close-up, sees his pores, and he's turning beet red. A fire had been kindled in the king, and he's inflamed with anger. His eyes open wide, his nostrils flared, his teeth gritted, his breathing became more forced. What a strange sight to see at a victory parade. But everybody saw it. Everyone knew this is what he was feeling. He shook violently, overreacting to the people's celebration, completely given over to a bizarre imagination that David would now seize control of the kingdom. Now, what had Saul known about David that made him think that this was a possibility? He knew nothing about David, apparently. But listen to this, folks. People like Saul, leaders, men, people with a Saul heart, will always assume their motives upon anyone else. They will always fear and believe the worst because that's how they would act in that environment. Saul knew that if he had the capital that David had right now, this is how he would use it. And so he looks at David completely cut off from who David actually is and just believes this guy is going to act this way because this is the way Saul would act. From this moment on, Saul doesn't just look at David. He doesn't just take anything at face value. He now puts on an air of suspicion over every action he will do. Have you ever been in a relationship with somebody like that? You say hello. Oh, why didn't you say hi? You bring them coffee, and it's like, what? No sugars? What's in this? You ever been in a relationship with somebody like that? You can't say anything right. You can't do anything right. You get in 10 minutes early. Oh, you're trying to take my job? You're trying to hang out with the staff before I get here? You're 10 minutes late. Oh, what? You don't care about God? You don't care about God's kingdom anymore? You get there right on time? Oh, so you think you're just going to come on right on time. You don't want to get here a little earlier to get started on time? Nothing you can do will satisfy that person. From that moment on, David is walking on eggshells completely. And what a thing. Same family. Jonathan has done everything to prop David up. Here's a guy who has given up thinking that he's going to be the next king. He's same family, same bloodline. He has given him everything that a prince needs. Saul's going to take the opposite road. And he's going to do everything he can to ruin his rival. Fascinating. Same family, same opportunity, same light, same understanding of God. Two completely different ways to respond. Let me ask you something right now before we even move on. Are you more of a Saul or are you more of a Jonathan when you see people like this? Are you more willing to look at a person and say, I want to do what I can to make sure that they're thriving in the Lord? Then you're a Jonathan. How can I help them? How can I build them up? How can I minister and help them to be what God's calling them to be? You're a Jonathan. But you're a Saul when you're trying to figure out ways to bring them down. When you're looking for ways. When you just believe the worst about that person. I would caution you that there's a lot of Saul in you. And you need to pray about that. Because there's nothing about having a Saul heart that's any good. There's not a point in the Bible anywhere where it says, you ought to have a Saul's heart. Oh no, that's nothing you want anything to do with. Let's take a look at how he subverted. Verse 10. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times. But there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Now, for those who love the Lord, the time after a victory is difficult. There's always a letdown. There's always attacks to be worried about. Imagine what it's like for a person who only loves themselves. Saul had nothing internally to prop him up. He's the kind of person who needs the stimulation of a victory party. He needed to be the center of attention. He needed the cheers and the adulation of the crowd. Sauls always do. Sauls always need to be thought of as the greatest and the best and the focal point. And when that was gone, the mental fall was precipitous. He went from the emotional high of a victory parade back to that empty, quiet palace where the distressing spirit from the Lord waited. And predictably, it rushed upon him with a vengeance. This translation, if you own a New King James, as I do, this translation, he prophesied inside the house as a poor one. I believe the NIV has it best, where it says that the Spirit came forcibly upon him, and then the NLT adds that he began to rave around the house like a madman. That makes sense. He was completely out of control. Now, we aren't told if this was the new normal response or if it was heightened during this time, but Saul's servants, they only have one recourse. Call in the musician. Bring David in. I wonder if David's representatives at this point, David doesn't do that anymore. He's out practicing with his sling, signing some autographs. No. Look at what happens. David comes back in. He resumes his place of service in Saul's palace. Wait a minute. I've got the anointing. I've got the Samuel aftershave. And not only that, he pulls out his bag, I've got the head of Goliath. Look at that sucker. That's huge. No, he doesn't ever once promote himself. And he never once seeks anything other than what God is willing to give him. So what does he do? He plays his harp. He's just as happy playing his harp because he is God's man. He's so confident in the Lord, he could be asked to do anything and he'll be glad to do it. So he goes. He's willing to serve, but the music had no effect. It had no effect, no matter how he tried to play it. He started off with the usual, kind of new age sounding, smooth jazz harp work. He moved on to Yngwie Malmsteen playing with his teeth, distortion. No matter what he tried, it just got worse. Saul took the moment when he was defenseless and he grabbed a spear and he chucked it at David. Now, two words really stand out to me when you read that last verse. He escaped twice. Did you see that? He escaped twice. David simply escaped Saul's presence. What does that tell you? That tells you that when Saul threw the spear, David did not get the spear out of the wall and return it. Some of you are going, well, how come he didn't? That's what I'd have done. But it happened twice. So he escaped twice, not even once, pulling out the spear and throwing it back at him. Would you and I have questioned that? Here's a man, someone has attempted to kill you. Would you feel okay having pulled the spear out? You're pretty good with a sling. I'm imagining you'd be pretty good with a spear. Don't you think it would have been fine? Justifiable? Do you think any of Saul's servants would have said, oh, yeah, well, he was a madman. No problem. But David didn't do this. Why? His kingdom would have been established, but it would have been established on infamy. For a man of God, and I want you to hear this very clearly, there are no shortcuts. There are no shortcuts in the practice of holiness and of being surrendered to the Lord. I wish I could sleep at night and put together a sermon series like, 7 ways to be powerful, 4 ways to, and just every, we're doing a new sermon topic series. Forget Bible study. I'm just going to pull out what I want from the Bible and just make a series out of it. We'd be full every week. But I would be a fool every week. No thanks. Godly things and godly character require time, obedience, repeat. And anything that grows fast is suspect, spiritually speaking. And let me further say, the character of a godly man. You might be thinking, hey, it's not fair. I mean, he's a guy. Why does he have to be around Saul? Why doesn't God just take Saul out? Maybe you're wondering that. How come I can't go to work and not have to deal with so-and-so? That person you're thinking of right now, maybe even in your family. Why do they have to exist? Why can't God just take their blasphemous ways and destroy them now? Guys, I know this is hard for you to swallow. It's hard for me to swallow. But listen to this. You need Sauls in your life. Because more important than your character, or more important than your comfort, is your character in the kingdom. And if you don't have a Saul in your life, you'll never be a David. Because you need to be sick with seeing what Sauls produce so that you can be a David. Best things that have ever happened in my life. I thank the Lord for them now. I did not thank Him for them then. The best things that ever happened in my life were the things that I watched that were grievous to my soul every day. Because that made me make a commitment that our church has been built on. And I will gladly go back and live that for the sake of this. Every time. Saul threw the spear. David wouldn't, because that would have made David like Saul. Verse 12. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence, made him captain over 1,000. He went out and came in before the people. And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. Hold on, time out. Saul's afraid of David? Wait, Saul's the one with the spear. It doesn't say that David was afraid of Saul. Why is it that Saul was so afraid and David not afraid at all? The answer is the same. The Lord was with David. When you know God's presence, and you trust His protection, there isn't a giant or an authority on this earth that can inspire fear in your heart. If there's fear in your heart, you need to have a bigger vision of who God is. You need to know that God has called you into certain things so that you can walk in confidence and not fear when a spear gets thrown at you. Nor respond in like manner. Only those who know the Lord and His confident trust can live this way. But when your heart isn't like that, like Saul, you'll look for anything that comes into your hand to throw at that person. And you'll find that nothing will penetrate that shield, which is, in actuality, the very hand of God covering His man. In the same way that David could have tripped and fell and thrown that rock backward and it would have hit on target, Saul could have had the most perfect aim and it would never have come close to him. That's the truth, and that's his fear. And I'll tell you what, one can never overestimate or underestimate the fear that God's presence strikes in the hearts of men who are not converted, who are resisting Him. Saul does what every Saul ever does. When that person's in our midst, when you are in that person's midst, they will do everything they can to get you out of their midst. Saul just wanted him out. So he relocates him to a dangerous area of service. He puts him in harm's way as the captain over 1,000 men. In those days, the captains didn't fight from a safe distance. They fought from the front lines. But despite the difficulty of the assignment, David succeeded again because the Lord was with him. Obedience to God's word and will leads to an awareness of God's leading and guiding hand, which in turn leads to success. But please don't miss the lesson here. David behaved properly. The Lord is with us. That doesn't mean that we act any way we want. We live carefully, strategically, doing the right things that God has spelled out for us in His Word. And when we do that, God meets us and strengthens our efforts. The fact that he did so well didn't sit well with Saul, and to add insult to injury, what had been used by Saul to detract from David's reputation actually added to it. How frustrating to be a Saul, to fight against what God wants in someone else's life. The people that he loved led him. So Saul needs another strategy. Check out what he does. Verse 17. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." Saul had been offered, or remember, you'll look back in chapter 17, Saul had offered the man who killed the giant his daughter as a wife. Do you remember that? Here, he adds this condition that he continue to fight these battles against the Philistines. How is it that him marrying Merab, whose name actually means increase, how is it that that endangers David? The Philistines would set their sights upon David with an even greater focus. Being the king's son-in-law means bigger target. Verse 18, so David said to Saul, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to a king? But it happened at that time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Maholathite as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. And Saul commanded his servants, communicate with David secretly and say, look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke those words in the hearing of David, and David said, does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor and lightly esteemed man? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, in this manner David spoke. Then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. The interesting thing here, Saul just decides to give Merab to another, presumably to provoke David to anger. He treats his own daughter like a weapon, hoping to enrage David. Think about what he's doing. He threw a spear twice, hoping to kill him or make him defend himself, causing him to look like a traitor in the king's palace. Then he removes his daughter from him publicly in order to shame and anger him. Neither time does David bite on those opportunities. So he tries another daughter and another plan. Saul sees this open door when Michal professes her love for David. And he's excited to use his other daughter not to bless, but to trap David. Some scholars believe that Michal had already revealed herself to be impetuous and self-centered, and certainly not very spiritual. I don't think that's much of a stretch, and we'll eventually see that. But Saul's design here is to couple his carnal daughter with this spiritual man. Even Saul knows that a mismatched, unequally yoked marriage brings devastation to a person's effectiveness for God. It just so happens my daughter is not in here today because I really did plan to have a great line for her as she's single, of course, being only 14, almost 14. But I tell you what, there is no damage that can be done in a life like that of marrying somebody who doesn't love Jesus with all their heart. Nothing like it. Saul makes sure to remove any hesitancy from David. As David is told through back channels not to worry about providing a dowry. That's the ancient equivalent of a prenup for Michal. Saul simply required, no big deal, 100 Philistine foreskins. Folks, just so you know, you don't just get those at Walmart. They don't sell them in packs. This would obviously require killing 100 men and provoking Philistine retribution. They're not going to take this lightly. The Philistines mocked the concept of circumcision. And the Israelis, remember what David, when he cursed back when he cursed those guys, when any of Israel did, they said, those uncircumcised Philistines. So if David were to do this, he would be desecrating the bodies of soldiers. Saul knows what he's asking here. He's asking, basically, David to spit upon, that's a nice way to put it, the dead bodies of Philistines. Look at how David responds. Verse 28, thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with verse 26. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. David knew how to get 100 foreskins. The king had put a time limit on this, on the delivery of this dangerous and disgusting dowry. David planned out an attack and successfully took out not 100, but 200 Philistines. I am so glad. I'll tell you, oftentimes we talk about renting videos in heaven of scenes. This scene is the one where it'll always be available. No one will ever rent this video. I'm guaranteeing it. Because they took 200 in full count. That's gross. That's so gross. Saul couldn't believe it. David survived this thing. To make matters worse, David is now in his very family. Talk about your epic fail. Verse 28, thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. Everything Saul tried turned right around on him. He tried to kill David personally. He tried to humiliate him publicly. He hoped the Philistines would damage him permanently. He wanted to see Michal compromise him perpetually. But doggone it, Michal loved him. Their marriage, at least at first, was successful. Do you think Saul would give up? All right, I give. I just can't kill you. Why can I not kill you? What's it going to take to get rid of this guy? You think, logic, you'd think a man would say, obviously I am in the wrong, I submit, I surrender, I give up. God, you know what's right, I'm stepping down. This guy is your guy, obviously. You would think somebody would do that. So Saul became David's enemy continually. On the one hand, from a human perspective, this is what a Saul must do, because Sauls have to keep their kingdom. Their kingdom is more important than any other thing in their life. So if you run into a Saul, if you work for a Saul, if you know a Saul, understand they will never be anything other than that. And they must always come against you. Always. From a heavenly perspective, God's going to make David the king. And here's a Saul standing in the way, saying, this is my throne. A person like Saul only digresses toward greater fear. And against all wisdom, he becomes his enemy. The highest power in the land of Israel is now focused upon the eradication of one man God intended to promote. Of course, the Philistines, they retaliated against David, but as always, David conducted himself better than any other servant in his service. Let me tell you something, folks. Do you see that? Do you understand? David could simply roll around in self-pity. Here, I've done all this stuff, man. What is it going to take for this guy to recognize me, to stop persecuting me, to stop bringing this stuff down upon me? He could have said, you know what? Go fight your own battles. Go get your own foreskins. I can't believe anyone would ever say something like that. But he keeps serving. And he doesn't just keep serving, he keeps excelling above all the other servants. Some of us are thinking, when I get treated a certain way, I'll start serving better. Not the heart of God. Not the heart of God. When my wife starts treating me better, starts giving me what I want or need more, I'll be that person. I'll live in that call. Not God's way. Imagine every time the armies would come back, Saul's sitting there taking the roll. He's just hoping, he's just praying. Oh, please, please let David be dead. And every time, all the roll would be called, David's name would be last, and you'd see this little tiny guy running through and he goes, I'm here! Hey, Dad! How you doing, Pop? The royal headache continued as David's name grew in great popularity. The phrase in Hebrew would sound like this: the beloved, David's name, beloved, the beloved became precious. Now, Saul refuses to bow to God's wisdom. He throws spears. He conceives underhanded plots. He seeks to position men for destruction. The Lord allows people like this in our life so we can see the futility and be soured on ever trusting in these fleshly measures. A person after God's heart won't return a spear that has been thrown. They won't let public shaming produce a fit of rage. They won't do anything that endangers God's presence with them, nor casts aspersion on the name of the God who called them. David shows us a king who would not return insult for insult, but would humble himself to serve even the most maniacal ruler in the land. What a wonderful picture of Jesus, huh? The person who's our hero, our example. He's the one whose character that David reflects and the one whose character the Spirit injects into us. You might be sitting here and railing already in your heart mentally, and I understand. I sympathize. I've been in your shoes, and they're not comfortable. You're wondering, why do I have to act? Because in this relationship with this boss or this person, why do I have to be the godly one? Why do I have to do the right thing when they're treating me this way? You will if you want God's heart. And the end of that story is God's name is highly exalted. What will happen with us when we humble ourselves? When we take on the same mindset as Christ? May the Lord give us wisdom. May He give us His strength as He produces His character in us. Let's pray.